What happens when a calm, respected Hollywood icon walks onto a daytime talk show expecting polite conversation, and instead finds himself pushed, cornered, and publicly challenged on live television? What happens when silence is no longer an option, and dignity finally speaks louder than diplomacy? Before this story unfolds, pause for just a moment. Subscribe to The Truth Narrator, hit like, and drop a comment, because moments like this don't happen often, and when they do, they change everything. The studio lights of The View burned hotter than usual that morning. There was an electricity in the air, the kind you feel before a storm, but can't quite explain. The audience filed in, murmuring with curiosity, some holding coffee cups, others clutching phones, all unaware that they were about to witness a moment that would ripple far beyond the studio. The hosts settled into their seats, smiles practiced, papers neatly stacked. Whoopi Goldberg leaned back slightly, relaxed, confident, a veteran of confrontation and controversy. She had been here before many times. This was her territory. Then Idris Elba walked out. Tall, composed, impeccably dressed, Idris carried himself with the quiet gravity of a man who had nothing to prove. The applause was immediate, warm, genuine. He acknowledged it with a nod, a small smile, the kind that suggested gratitude but also restraint. He took his seat, adjusted his jacket, and folded his hands together. At first glance, it looked like any other celebrity interview. Polite greetings, light laughter, a shared sense of routine. But beneath the surface, something was already shifting. The conversation began smoothly enough. Film projects, creative journeys, the weight of responsibility that comes with fame. Idris spoke thoughtfully, his voice steady, his words measured. He talked about storytelling, about representation, about the pressure of being seen not just as an actor, but as a symbol. The audience listened intently. Even the hosts nodded along. For a moment, it felt safe. Then Whoopi leaned forward. Her tone changed, not abruptly, but subtly, like a blade sliding out of a sheath. She referenced past comments Idris had made in interviews, statements about race, identity, and the expectations placed on Black actors in Hollywood. She framed it as a question, but it wasn't really a question. It was a challenge. "So let me ask you this," Whoopi said, her voice calm but pointed. "Do you think you've done enough? Or are you comfortable benefiting from a system you criticize?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Idris blinked once. Just once. He hadn't expected that. Not like this, not here. He shifted in his seat, drawing a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I think the work speaks for itself," he replied. "And I believe change happens in many ways, not just one." Whoopi didn't let it rest. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "But isn't that a convenient answer? Saying many ways without committing to any real accountability." The temperature in the room rose. One of the co-hosts glanced down at her notes. Another forced a smile that didn't quite land. The audience grew quieter, leaning in, sensing the tension building but unsure where it would lead. Inside, Idris felt something tighten. Not anger, yet, but resolve. He had spent years navigating spaces like this, smiling through discomfort, deflecting loaded questions with grace. But this felt different. This felt personal, public, and unfair. "With respect," he said slowly, his voice still controlled, "accountability doesn't always look the way people expect. It's not always loud." Whoopi raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying criticism is noise?" A few gasps escaped the audience before they could stop themselves. Idris's jaw clenched just slightly. He glanced out at the crowd, then back at Whoopi. The cameras zoomed in, catching every micro-expression, every flicker of emotion. "No," he said. "I'm saying conversation matters. But so does listening." For the first time, the balance shifted. Whoopi leaned back, crossing her arms. The silence that followed was heavy, almost oppressive. You could hear someone clear their throat in the audience. A producer off-camera whispered urgently into a headset. The other hosts attempted to steer the conversation elsewhere, tossing out a lighter question, a safer topic. Idris answered politely, but something had changed. The ease was gone. His posture was straighter now, his eyes more focused. He wasn't here just to promote a film anymore. He was here to defend himself. Whoopi wasn't finished. "You know," she said, cutting back in, "people look up to you. They expect more than just words." Idris exhaled slowly. This time, when he spoke, there was steel beneath the calm. "And I don't take that lightly," he said. "But I also won't accept being told that my lived experience, or my choices, are somehow insufficient because they don't align with someone else's idea of activism." The audience erupted, not loud applause, but scattered reactions. Some clapped. Some stayed silent. Some exchanged uneasy looks. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't safe television. This was real. Whoopi opened her mouth to respond, but for a brief moment, she hesitated. The camera caught it. That split second of recalibration. Idris had pushed back, not aggressively, not disrespectfully, but firmly. And the room felt it. The lights seemed brighter now. The air heavier. Somewhere backstage, producers debated whether to cut to commercial. But it was too late. The moment had already taken on a life of its own. Idris sat there, composed but unyielding. A man who had finally decided that being polite did not mean being silent. And as the tension lingered, one truth became clear to everyone watching. This conversation was no longer just an interview. It was a reckoning. The silence that followed felt endless, stretching across the studio like a held breath no one dared release. The applause had faded, leaving behind an uneasy stillness that pressed against the walls. Idris Elba remained upright in his chair, hands clasped loosely, eyes steady. On the surface, he looked calm. Inside, his thoughts were racing, not in panic, but in clarity. He knew exactly what was happening now. This was no longer a conversation drifting off script. This was a test. Whoopi Goldberg broke the silence with a short, controlled laugh, the kind meant to reset the room. "All right," she said, gesturing lightly with her hand. "Let's not pretend this isn't an important discussion." Idris nodded once. "I agree. It is." But the way he said it, measured, unwavering, shifted the power dynamic yet again. The audience sensed it. You could feel them recalibrating, deciding who they were rooting for, or whether they even wanted to choose sides at all. Whoopi leaned forward this time, elbows on the table, her voice lower but sharper. "The thing is, Idris, when you have the platform you have, people expect leadership. Not just success." A co-host attempted to interject, offering a softer framing, but Whoopi waved it off without even looking. Her attention was locked on Idris. This was personal now, not emotional but ideological. Idris inhaled slowly. He glanced down for a moment, then looked back up, meeting Whoopi's gaze directly. The cameras zoomed in again, capturing the subtle tightening around his eyes. "Leadership doesn't come in one uniform," he said. "And it doesn't require permission." A ripple of reaction moved through the audience, this time louder. Someone clapped openly. Someone else whispered, "Wow." The energy shifted again, like a pendulum swinging back. Whoopi's smile thinned. "But when people call you out," she said, "you can't just dismiss it as misunderstanding." Idris's voice dropped slightly, quieter but firmer. "I'm not dismissing anyone. I'm refusing to be boxed." That line landed hard. For a split second, Whoopi looked genuinely surprised. Not offended, surprised. She had challenged hundreds of guests over the years, politicians, actors, activists. Most deflected. Some fumbled. A few snapped. Idris was doing something else entirely. He was standing his ground without raising his voice. The other hosts exchanged looks. One of them shifted in her chair, another reached for her mug, hands trembling just enough to notice. This was live television, and the script was gone. "You know," Whoopi said slowly, "some would say that's exactly the kind of response that avoids responsibility." The audience murmured again. The tension was no longer subtle. It was thick, layered, almost cinematic. Idris felt a flicker of frustration rise in his chest, but he kept it in check. He had spent decades mastering this moment, this precise intersection of provocation and poise. "I've spent my entire career taking responsibility," he replied. "For my work, for my words, for my community. What I won't take responsibility for is someone else's narrative about me." That did it. The audience reacted in waves, applause breaking out in pockets, some louder than others. A few people stood halfway out of their seats before sitting back down, unsure if it was appropriate. The producers let it run. Cutting to commercial now would only make it worse. Whoopi leaned back, arms crossed again, but this time there was something else in her expression. Not dominance, not dismissal, calculation. "So you're saying the criticism is unfair," she said. "I'm saying it's incomplete," Idris answered immediately. "And incomplete stories do damage." The room fell quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't awkward, it was attentive. The audience was listening now, really listening. Even the hosts who had tried to steer away earlier were watching closely, pens forgotten. Idris continued, his voice gaining momentum. Not louder, but more assured. "We live in a world where people think they know you because they've seen you. But visibility isn't the same as understanding." Whoopi opened her mouth to respond, then paused. That pause spoke volumes. She nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the weight of his words without conceding ground. And yet, she said, public figures don't get the luxury of privacy. Idris smiled faintly, not amused but resolute. Privacy isn't what I'm asking for. Respect is. The applause this time was louder, more unified. It surprised even the audience themselves. Some clapped instinctively, others after a beat, realizing they'd been holding back. The energy in the room surged. One of the co-hosts finally stepped in, trying to soften the exchange. I think what Idris is saying is... But Whoopi raised her hand gently, stopping her. Her eyes never left Idris. No, she said. Let him finish. Idris nodded in appreciation, though his focus remained steady. All I've ever asked, he said, is to be allowed to exist fully. Not as a symbol, not as a spokesperson, as a human being who contributes in his own way. The studio lights hummed softly overhead. Somewhere off camera, a stage manager wiped sweat from his brow. This was not the segment they'd planned, but it was the one everyone would remember. Whoopi exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. You know, she said, this is why these conversations matter, even when they get uncomfortable. Idris met her halfway with a nod. Especially then. The audience applauded again, sustained this time. Not explosive, but respectful. The kind of applause reserved for moments that feel honest, even when unresolved. But beneath the surface, everyone knew this wasn't over. The tension hadn't dissolved, it had evolved. What began as a challenge had become a standoff, not fueled by anger, but by conviction. And as the cameras kept rolling, one thing was clear to everyone watching, both in the studio and at home. This was no longer about a question asked on a talk show. It was about who gets to define the truth. The applause slowly tapered off, but the weight of what had just been said lingered in the air like static after a lightning strike. No one moved right away. Even the audience seemed unsure whether to settle back or stay on edge. Idris Elba sat still, shoulders squared, gaze steady, his calm now carrying a quiet authority that filled the space. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg adjusted her glasses, her expression thoughtful, but there was no retreat in her posture. If anything, she looked more engaged than before. All right, Whoopi said at last, her voice even but firm. Let's talk about truth then. That single sentence drew everyone back in. The cameras subtly tightened their frames. This wasn't a segment anymore. It was a moment unfolding in real time, unpredictable and raw. You say people tell incomplete stories about you, Whoopi continued. But public figures don't just inherit narratives. They help shape them. Idris nodded slowly, acknowledging the point. That's true, he said. But shaping doesn't mean surrendering. A murmur moved through the audience. Someone in the front row leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on the stage. The producers allowed the silence to breathe, knowing that every second added gravity. Whoopi tilted her head. Then help me understand, she said. When fans and critics say you've stayed silent at key moments, what are they missing? For the first time since the exchange began, Idris hesitated, not out of fear, but reflection. His jaw relaxed, and he looked briefly toward the floor, as if choosing whether to open a door he'd kept closed for a long time. They're missing the work that doesn't make headlines, he said quietly. The conversations that happen off camera. The doors opened without announcements. The people helped without press releases. The room softened just slightly. Even the most skeptical faces in the audience shifted. This was no longer defensive. It was confessional. Whoopi listened closely, her expression unreadable. But do you see how that can feel invisible? She asked. Especially to people who are desperate to see change. Idris lifted his gaze again, meeting hers. I do, he said. And I respect that frustration. But I won't perform activism to prove my sincerity. That line hit like a drumbeat. The audience reacted audibly. Some gasps, some applause, some quiet nods of agreement. A co-host whispered, That's a bar, barely audible but caught by a nearby microphone. Whoopi leaned back, exhaling through her nose. You're saying the performance is the problem. I'm saying substance matters more than spectacle, Idris replied. The exchange had shifted again. The sharp edges were still there, but now they were cutting through something deeper. Expectation, perception, identity. The hosts were no longer steering. They were witnessing. Let me ask you this then, Whoopi said, her voice lowering. Do you ever worry that staying quiet lets others speak for you? Idris's lips pressed together briefly. This question landed closer to home. He nodded once. Every day, he admitted. But I also worry that speaking too loudly turns the message into noise. The audience was silent now, completely still. Even the faint rustle of clothing had stopped. This was the kind of honesty that doesn't invite interruption. I grew up learning that respect isn't demanded, Idris continued. It's demonstrated. And sometimes that means not shouting when the world expects you to. Whoopi studied him carefully. There was no hostility in her gaze now, only intensity. You know, she said slowly, some people will hear that and call it avoidance. Idris didn't flinch. They can, he said. But they'd be wrong. The confidence in his voice wasn't loud or aggressive. It was grounded, earned. The audience felt it, responding with a wave of applause that rose organically, filling the studio. One of the co-hosts finally broke in, trying to lighten the mood. Well, she said with a nervous laugh, this is definitely not your average morning conversation. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, easing the tension just enough to breathe. Even Whoopi smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. But maybe it should be, Idris said, turning slightly toward her. Because these are the conversations we keep postponing. The camera caught Whoopi nodding slowly. I'll give you that, she said. Comfort hasn't exactly moved the needle. The audience applauded again, louder this time. The confrontation had transformed into something else, still charged but purposeful. Yet beneath the applause, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. No clear winner. No clean resolution. Just two powerful voices standing firm in their truths. Idris felt the shift. He knew the moment was reaching its peak. Whatever came next would define how this exchange would be remembered, not just as a clash, but as a statement. Whoopi leaned forward one last time. So where does that leave us? She asked. If everyone believes they're right, how do we move forward? Idris didn't answer right away. He looked out at the audience, then back at Whoopi, his expression thoughtful, almost solemn. It leaves us listening, he said, even when we don't like what we hear. The studio erupted, not in chaos, but in sustained applause. Some people stood. Others clapped seated, eyes shining. The energy was undeniable. But even as the applause echoed, one truth settled heavily over the room. This wasn't finished yet. The hardest part was still coming. The applause rolled on longer than anyone expected, swelling into something almost cathartic. It wasn't the kind of applause reserved for a joke or a polished answer. It was the sound of release, of tension finally given permission to breathe. Some audience members were on their feet now, clapping with conviction. Others stayed seated, hands moving slowly, faces thoughtful, as if they'd just witnessed something they weren't fully ready to process. Idris Elba remained standing only in spirit, still seated but grounded, his presence filling the space in a way that felt heavier than volume. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg nodded once, then twice, acknowledging the moment without surrendering it. She waited for the room to settle, a seasoned instinct honed by decades of live television. When the applause finally softened, Whoopi spoke again, her voice calmer, stripped of edge. You know, she said, this isn't about winning an argument. Idris turned slightly toward her. I never thought it was. That exchange alone shifted the tone completely. The confrontation hadn't dissolved, but it had transformed. The sharpness gave way to something more reflective, more dangerous in its honesty. One thing I will say, Whoopi continued, choosing her words carefully now, is that conversations like this don't usually happen on TV. Not like this. Idris nodded. That's part of the problem. A quiet ripple of agreement moved through the audience. The co-hosts, who had largely stayed silent during the peak of the exchange, now leaned in, sensing the conversation entering its final phase. But let me be clear, Whoopi added. When I push, it's not to tear down. It's because I care about what comes next. Idris met her gaze, unwavering. And when I push back, he replied, it's because I care about being understood, not assumed. There it was, the final alignment. Not agreement, but mutual recognition. The audience responded with another round of applause, steadier now, more unified. The cameras panned across faces, some moved, some conflicted, some visibly emotional. A woman in the second row wiped at her eyes. A man near the aisle shook his head slowly, as if replaying the conversation in his mind. One of the co-hosts finally spoke up, her voice softer. I think a lot of people watching at home are going to have feelings about this. Whoopi glanced toward the camera. They already do. And she was right. Even as the show continued, producers later revealed that social media was already exploding. Clips were being uploaded in real time. Hashtags began trending before the segment had even ended. Some praised Idris for his composure, calling the moment measured strength and class under fire. Others defended Whoopi, arguing that hard questions were necessary and overdue. And then there were those who simply said, "This is what real conversation looks like." Back in the studio, the energy shifted again. Not tense, not confrontational, but heavy with consequence. Idris sensed it. He straightened slightly, as if understanding that whatever he said next would echo far beyond these walls. "I want to say something," he said, unprompted. The hosts fell silent immediately. "I know people are watching this thinking they have to choose a side," Idris continued. "But that's not the point. The point is that discomfort doesn't mean disrespect. And disagreement doesn't mean division." The room was completely still. "If we can sit here," he added, "challenge each other, and still listen, then maybe there's hope for conversations beyond this table." The applause that followed was immediate and sustained. This time, it wasn't fragmented. It was collective. Whoopi stood slightly in her seat, pressing her hands together once before resting them on the table. "That," she said, "is a fair place to land." The segment moved on after that, but everyone in the studio knew the truth. The show had already peaked. What followed felt procedural, almost unreal, as if reality needed time to catch up. When the cameras finally cut to commercial, the room exhaled. Crew members whispered urgently. A producer rubbed his temples, already anticipating the headlines. Idris took a sip of water, his hand steady. Whoopi adjusted her glasses, thoughtful, composed. No one smiled casually, because this wasn't going to fade by the afternoon. Within hours, the clip dominated timelines. Comment sections filled with debate. Some called it brave. Others called it uncomfortable. Many called it necessary. Media outlets dissected every sentence, every pause, every look. Body language experts weighed in. Opinion pieces flooded in from all sides. But through all the noise, one thing remained undeniable. People were talking. And they weren't talking about gossip. They were talking about truth, expectation, voice, and the cost of silence. Idris Elba had come onto The View expecting a conversation. He left having ignited one. And Whoopi Goldberg, known for never backing away from the fire, had met him there, head-on. No villain. No hero. Just two powerful voices colliding in public and refusing to pretend it didn't matter. Now the question shifts to you. What did you see in that moment? Strength? Tension? Respect? Or something unresolved? Share your opinion in the comments. I want to hear how you read that exchange. And if you want more stories like this, where the truth isn't polished but exposed in real time, subscribe to The Truth Narrator and stay with us. Because the most powerful moments aren't scripted. They're confronted.